Hi grade 12s, it's me, your teacher. So today I'm just going to finish off the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the last time I was here we spoke about how the crisis started to intensify, the blockade that was put into place, and the two letters that Khrushchev sent to Kennedy. The first one being the USA must promise not to invade Cuba, and then the Soviet Union will remove their missiles, and the second one being more of an ultimatum where the USA either had to remove their missiles from Turkey to get the Soviet Union to remove their missiles from Cuba, or they had to risk nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So today I'm just going to finish that off. It shouldn't take me more than about 5 minutes, and then we'll speak about the results of the crisis. So on the 27th of October, so that's the day after the the day after the letters were sent, the world was on the brink of a nuclear war. So you remember that term brinkmanship, where you push the other person to the edge hoping that they will stand down. So you can actually literally see how the United States and the Soviet Union were pushing each other. The United States with the blockade, the Soviet Union responds with the first letter, then the Soviet Union responds with the second letter, that ultimatum, and whoever steps down first is going to be the one that will be blamed if nuclear war breaks out. So it was so bad on the 27th of October that President Kennedy was actually 100% expecting that nuclear war would break out, and he sent his wife and children to Washington so they could be in the presidential bunker. So it becomes really, really bad. Everybody's worried that nuclear war will break out. Many Americans start panic buying and start stockpiling in case of nuclear Armageddon. So also on the 27th of October, a second U-2 plane flies into Soviet airspace, and at this stage Kennedy is now backing down. Kennedy apologizes that this spy plane is in Soviet airspace, and he enlists his brother Robert Kennedy to help him solve the crisis. Robert Kennedy basically suggests that the USA should reply to the first message, the one that says they will promise not to invade Cuba, and ignore the second, more aggressive one. So also on the 27th of October, when Kennedy replies to Khrushchev, he says that the USA will promise not to invade Cuba. However, they will not make a decision on Turkey. So in this way, he manages to save face because he's not giving in to Soviet demands at a point of a gun, as his advisors had said. He's promising not to invade Cuba, like it said in the first letter. So now he throws the ball back in Khrushchev's court. Khrushchev needs to decide, what is he going to do when he gets this letter? And basically what ends up happening is that in return for the Cuban guarantee, America wanted the withdrawal of the Soviet missiles from Cuba. And what Khrushchev did is he sent his foreign secretary, Anatoly Dobrinin, I think his name was, to speak with Robert Kennedy, and they make a secret agreement. The secret agreement basically said that the USA would remove the missiles from Turkey, but they would not do it publicly. On the 28th of October, the Cuban Missile Crisis is eventually resolved, with Radio Moscow announcing that the nuclear weapons would be removed. Privately, and very importantly, secretly, the Americans agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey as long as the Soviet Union kept it a secret. So this has a couple of kind of knock-on effects. The first is that the USA is able to save face because it looks like Kennedy is this big tough guy, and all he had to do was make a promise not to invade Cuba, and the Soviet Union just fell over and said, okay, that's fine. That's what it looks like to everyone else. What everyone else doesn't know is that an agreement was made behind the scenes that they would also remove their missiles. But because this agreement was not public knowledge, it actually made the Soviet Union look like the weaker country, like they are giving in to American, like they're basically getting off with a slap on the wrist. So that is basically the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and as I predicted, it took me exactly 5 minutes. Alright, so these are the Kennedy's options during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm not going to go into it, just quickly running through it, just so that you know if you get a question in the exam asking what were Kennedy's options, you will know what they are. So the first option was the Hawks. Basically, they wanted swift military action. They wanted to have a nuclear strike on the missile sites. But if they did that, the Soviet Union would strike back. Because obviously, if you attack Cuba, it's like you are attacking the Soviet Union because they are allies. So they believed that they should have a conventional bombing raid followed by an invasion. However, the problem with this, it would lead to fighting with Soviet troops already in Cuba, and it would lead to nuclear war. Okay, so that was the one group. The Hawks, they just want to fight. That's all you need to know there. Then you've got the moderates. They kind of are in between the just wanting to fight and just wanting to negotiate. So they were led by a guy called Robert McNamara. They wanted to set up a naval blockade. And they were the one that said that the US Navy should stop the Soviet ships from reaching Cuba. The problem is, like I said before when I spoke about the blockade, is that the sea doesn't really belong to anyone, so the USA doesn't actually have a right to block the Soviet Union from trading with Cuba. So that might also create tension. And the other disadvantage is if the Soviets ignore their blockade and try to send a ship through regardless, and the USA makes good on their threat and destroys the Soviet ship, it will lead to war. The last one is the doves, and you know doves are always a symbol of peace. They advised Kennedy to be cautious, and they encouraged talks with the Soviet Union. The disadvantage of that was that the USA would appear weak. So there are your options, your advantages, your disadvantages. I'm not going to speak about that too much. You can read through it on your own. We know that at the end of the day, Kennedy chose option D, blockade Cuba with the US Navy, no Russian ships allowed through. The advantage of that was that there's limited pressure, which could be increased later. So they're being aggressive, but not too aggressive. They can either back down or take it further or escalate it. The disadvantage of that is that even if they put a blockade there, the missiles that are already in Cuba are not affected. It just stops any new missiles from coming into Cuba. Secondly, it leads to conflict with the Soviet Union instead of Cuba. So you don't want to have two big guys fighting. You'd rather want to fight with the little guy. And then lastly, the Soviet Union might do the same to West Berlin. Now, I didn't speak about the Berlin crisis. I mentioned it very briefly in the beginning of the unit. But basically, West Berlin and East Berlin were divided into communist and capitalist spheres. And because West Berlin was surrounded by Germany, half of which was under Soviet control, it was very easy for the Soviet Union to put a blockade on West Berlin, which was under the control of the USA. Alright, so let's go to the end. I'm going to skip that. Not important. So here is a picture about, this came in, I think, 2017 paper, and I got so many wrong answers. I thought, okay, let me just do this picture. So it was Source 1C. It's a cartoon by E. Voltman, which appeared in the Hartford Times of the 30th of October 1962. So that tells me that it is a primary source. It was created during the time or just after the crisis. You know, the crisis ended on the 28th of October. The caption states, "This hurts me more than it hurts you." So let's see. What can we see in this cartoon? Firstly, we see a guy over here, and we are very lucky because the department has labeled it for us. I apologize, my little thingy is appearing here. If I press that, will that, okay, it will stop presenting. Okay, so at the bottom, you can see that Castro is there. He's the guy that has his mouth open, and you can see there's something in his mouth, eh? It's where the teeth should be, but it's not teeth. You can see there's an arrow there pointing to missiles. Okay, so those things that's in Castro's mouth, where his teeth should be, are actually the nuclear missiles. Then, on the right-hand side, you see a man that is dressed like a dentist. He's got his pliers, and he is pulling, or is about to pull, these missiles out of Castro's mouth. And that guy is supposed to be Khrushchev. So, what is the message of this cartoon? You know, their favorite question to ask. And when my kids got this in the 2017 paper, you won't believe how many of them wrote, Khrushchev is pulling Castro's teeth. And I was like, oh. So, you shouldn't just write down what you see. You need to think about, what does this actually mean? When somebody removes all of your teeth, what are you doing to somebody? You are making them weak. You are disarming them. So by pulling the missiles out of Cuba, Khrushchev is making Castro weak. You know, have you heard the expression, a toothless dog? A toothless dog poses no threat to anybody. So Khrushchev is actually pulling the missiles out of Cuba. And yes, that is very, very painful for Castro. But it is also painful for Khrushchev. Why? Because he's essentially giving in to the USA by removing the missiles from Cuba. That's why he says, it hurts me more than it hurts you. So when it comes down to the exam and they ask you, what is the message of the cartoon? You would be able to say that the message of the cartoon is that Khrushchev is removing the missiles from Cuba, and this is making Cuba very weak. The reason we know this is because you can see that Khrushchev is removing the missiles from Castro. Alright, and then also the text, this hurts me more than this hurts you. Alright, so let's have a look at the results of the crisis. I'm just going to speed through it, try and finish this in 15 minutes. What was the result on Khrushchev? He claimed that he achieved the aim of preventing an American... Okay, apologies for that. So, carrying on. So, Khrushchev prevented an American invasion of Cuba, but he was criticized by China for backing down in the face of American threats. He lost face at home, and basically, because of this, making himself look weak, making him look like he capitulated to America, he was basically removed from power 2 years later. Basically fired. So, how did this affect Kennedy? He increased his reputation at home because it looks like he was the one that made Khrushchev stand down. And he also increased his reputation worldwide by avoiding a war and forcing Khrushchev to back down. Cuba remained a communist country dependent on the Soviet aid and protection, but Castro was not happy about the fact that Khrushchev removed the missiles. He felt betrayed, actually. And Khrushchev and Kennedy realized how close they had come to a nuclear war. And to try and prevent another crisis, they set up a hotline direct from the Kremlin to the White House, where they would improve relations and agree to a nuclear test ban. Alright, so that's it for the Cuban Missile Crisis. The next video, I'll just summarize what happens in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then we can finally move on to the Black Consciousness Movement. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoy your day further. Bye-bye!